first novelists on their process of writing their first novel, which I was happy to contribute to, because the idea was with this editor was that we hear a lot of, but not necessarily from the perspective of the writing of the first novels from first novelists. So she was putting together this collection, and she asked me to talk about inspirations. And anyway, what I was just working on was trying to articulate exactly that. It's like I believe all the writing is process. That is so much hard work and process and editing. But what I was trying to articulate in this article is that I really do believe that moment, I was calling it a crystal clear moment of that experience on the lake, and just realizing that sort of I guess just very simple idea really of the way that the past shapes the present just really was fundamental to me, and I hope what sort of continued as the thread throughout the novel and as the impulse throughout the novel. So as much as I was like constantly revising, and I just the book over the 7 years that I was working on it changed drastically, but that moment hopefully is still true to the book and throughout. So yeah, so I think that I would say that there's moments of there can be moments of clarity, but I don't really know what that means against the obvious complexity of everything that we've just been talking about here. If that, I don't think it separates from that. I don't think it creates some sort of whole solid unity out of that, but I do think that there's little sparks of within that.
Sure. Well, in our dialogic sessions, we have only one rule, and that is that the only wrong question is the unasked question. So, and this is really dialogue. So thank you, Toledo, for opening up the dialogue, and we invite others to ask, please. That's part of the dialogue. Flying head.
I like it. With the description, what you're inspired. So it was something what was flooded by water, what was behind you, reconstruct. But it would be like a general, it's like nice description. For example, cover-up story. We just making something from memory by our acts. We a little bit different, but how we are curiosity to decode it. So it's also in our personalities to decode it, what was flooded by water. So in many dimensions. So I like this example because it's like a tool to everything. What we have is just reality, what was before is our interpretation, but at least our effort making this. So this driving force, curiosity. What was before? What is this? So I find this very important. Like a scare. What was covered.
I had a question. You talked about how much rewriting you did, right? And you worked on the book 7 years, which is a hell of a long time. I was wondering at what point were you working with an editor, or
well, it started. My first draft of it I finished for Concordia MA program here, and so it was my MA dissertation in creative writing at Concordia University. So my first draft was just, I really did just write. Like I sat down every day. I was writing 10 pages, and it just got massive. And luckily for me, I had a supervisor who was willing to actually read the 500-page manuscript that I presented to him. But I was also lucky that his approach was just exactly what I needed at that time. I think that, had I been with a supervisor who had a different approach, who was more, who challenged me a little bit more to find at that point the way that it was going to fit into or ask more questions, or okay, so I'll just tell you his approach, so then you'll see how it could have been very different. Basically, what he drew straight lines down everything, like on the column, on the sides of what he thought was good, what he thought was okay, right on, you got it. And then some of it was blank, and then through the sections that he was like, okay, you could either, and he wasn't prescriptive about it, but you could either totally get rid of this, or you need to seriously rethink. And so it was straight line, squiggly line, straight line, squiggly line through the entire manuscript. And yeah, so I think that if I had been forced at that time to think more complicatedly about it, rather than just, okay, at this stage, just look at this and find out what your story is about, and whittle it down to what the story is about. Just, that was so important to me at that stage. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't had that approach at that time. So that's exactly what I needed. I got rid of about half of the material, and I defended it as my dissertation, but I knew that there was a lot more work. At this point then it was like, okay, now the questions have to be asked, now the editorial sort of, questions have to be asked, and but then I was done with the program, and I didn't really have the time to be working on it, and I just, in the way that I wanted, I really had a sense that with that project I really needed space and time so it was about 2 years that I didn't work on it, maybe hardly at all, maybe not at all. And then I picked it up again when I got a grant in 2007, and then was able to have that time again and completely revised it. But then it was, and at that time, then it was a friend actually who's a children's novelist, and he has also done script writing, and I think that this was it's so interesting because I sat down with him, he read my manuscript, and then he drew me the story pyramids, and like talked to me, and for me, like all things that I knew, but things that I hadn't, maybe that I knew, but I thought that I was rejecting, or that I didn't weight as heavily, and my impulse was not to write according to that arc, and I didn't really have the sense of that being really anything important to consider for my work. And I think that it was just so, I didn't take any of the advice that he gave me. Nothing, I don't think. But I think it was so important that I sat down with him and he drew that pyramid. And so it
gave you a different sense of what.
Yeah, I think it just sort of like reinserted that, which is like really a fundamental framework that even when you resist it, or even when you are sideways to that, it's still so much a part of our consciousness. I think of like how stories are shaped and made, and I just think that just thinking about it in those terms gave me another way, or a sense of clarity, that then even when I moved on and made the decisions that I did that disregarded some of his suggestions, that it was still there somehow in how I was approaching the text. It gave me a clarity of that. And at that point then it was like the sort of bigger shaping questions. I inserted the image of the boat, the figure of the boat, that sort of is a consistent image or figure throughout, and I feel sort of ties together to the different elements of the story, and that was necessary, that was needed. So it was at that point, and then afterwards I submitted it to it. By that time I was working with my publisher, Gasper Press, because they had published my poetry manuscript, and they're just fabulous to work with, and she was willing that the editor, Kate Kennedy, is not with them anymore, but was willing to look at the novel as well, and so through them, the two editors there at Gasper, we went over it again, and then that was sort of the most concerted editing stage. and that was hugely useful as well. But interestingly, I mean, after this, this is now an outdated version because there's the UK and US versions are slightly changed, and so it was sort of wonderful because I remember giving over the last the last version to Andrew, and he was so patient. Andrew Steves at Gasbro, and he was so patient with me, and he kept being like, okay, like here's just the PDF file, just take a quick look, and I'll put it, you know, print the galleys or whatever. I still don't know all the terminology. And I said okay, and I glanced at it, but I could not resist, and I was like, oh, could you just change like this and that? And he was so patient, and he's like, he did it. He every time he's like, we want to publish the best book, and we can, and would always make the changes, but it was just painful, I found, just giving over that and being like, okay, it's done. And so it was sort of like this wonderful gift then when in working with the publishers in UK and US, and it was the UK publisher that went through it, and he actually found some incongruencies in the story. Like I'd messed up a timeline. You can find these all now. There's some names that some actual real mistakes that he had caught, which no one had caught, or at least had alerted me to before. And but then at the same time, it allowed me. I mean, he had made a few editorial suggestions or small stuff, but it allowed me to also go over it and make a few little, tinkering changes, which was great. So.
It's the art of mastering, yeah?
Yeah, it was just really nice to go back to it at these different stages and to get that, because I always have a sense of nothing being really finished. And
since we're on the topic of changes and congruencies, the character Owen, he appears to be Canadian, but he's fighting in the American Army.
Well, I think that, that is open, totally open in the text. Do you want to hear what I think about Owen?
Oh, I've come up with different theories as to how that happened. Maybe his mother was American because
Well, there was a tremendous amount, not tremendous amount, but there was a significant amount of Canadians that did go down and fight in the Vietnam War. Just volunteers who were interested in the cause and or interested in the adventure or whatever personal reasons that they had, and joined up. So it wasn't. I mean. It's uncommon, but it wasn't like a total anomaly that Owen would have done that. But it is left unexplained. I don't delve into his reasons, but I was hoping, I did leave it very open. But I was hoping, in my sense, I wanted that his leaving and his seeking a challenge or a conflict, or to stand ground, or to have some connections, some tie-ins with that really traumatic moment where he gives up. He feels that he gives up his grandfather's house, and his grandfather makes this last stand for the land, and Owen feels very much that he's betrayed his grandfather by leaving the house, by saying it won't work. And so it's a very, for me, it's a tenuous and it's a loose connection, but I wanted it that way, just of these ideas of our loyalties and our the stands that we take and the challenges that we face, and for various personal reasons. I hope that thread was connective enough without being too connective, because I don't even myself really particularly want to draw too precise connection of why Owen decided to go, because I also think that the other thing about the present and the past and the way that they affect us, that so often I feel or the way that things disperse, is that I think that there's just a lot of things in people's impulses, and especially looked at retrospectively.